Hey guys. All right, we're still in the God King, a story in the days of King Hezekiah, chapter 25. This one is called The Confrontation. Are we ready? All right, here we go. The black tents circled the many-colored tabernacle. After the great swarm of Sennacherib's camp, after the endless lines of horses, the rows of the terrible rammed towers, they seemed few and paltry, only the tabernacle itself rivaling the proud tent of the Assyrian king. And there was another difference. This was a defeated army. The soldiers sat by their cookpots, heads hanging down, little heart left in them for talk and games. Even the rumor of news had awakened little interest. Would the king of Judah offer tribute to Pharaoh? What would they get out of it? The ostrich plumes drooped. The standards of the tribes with their beasts' heads hung limp. Beyond them lay the tents for the wounded. And Taharka remembered the school for the children of the god and the lessons in anatomy. How many of them had died? His eyes were drawn again to the tabernacle. He was in there. He was very angry, Taharka knew. Shabbataka didn't like to lose, but he had been given a second chance. He would go back to Thebes, to Napata, with a victory after all. Like Ramses the Great, he, too, would have tribute from the land of Canaan. And Taharka knew he would make them pay dearly for the humiliation he had suffered. A line of the tall Somali soldiers barred the approach to the tabernacle. Amos's voice was in his ear. Say nothing. You are the king. I will speak for you. The voice of the Judahite herald, the voice like a bullhorn, shivered the air. A message from my king, for him who calls himself king of Cush and Pharaoh of Egypt. For the first time, there was a stir among the soldiers. Who calls himself? What was this? A man came from the tabernacle, another spokesman, another Rab Shakah. Taharka didn't recognize him. He, too, was a Somali. Let them pass. Let the messengers of Judah approach the chair of Pharaoh. The herald looked at Taharka and Amos. Amos shook his head. Let him who calls himself Pharaoh come out. The Somali spokesman returned to the tent. For just a moment, he had looked hard at Taharka, surprised and curious. Let him be curious too, Taharka prayed in silence to Horus, the hawk, or Yahweh of the mountain. He didn't know which. Let him be curious enough to come out. Let him come. The flap of the tent was drawn back. The god came forth. A god, indeed, cloaked in the leopard skin, the double crown upon his head. Taharka was back again in the children's court in Napata as the god his father passed by. He wanted to fall on his knees and shield his eyes with the soldiers. He feared that the radiance might blind him. But his eyes held. As on that day on the docks at Thebes, he stood erect. And as on that day on the docks at Thebes, he saw Shabbataka's eyes widen in recognition. Amos was speaking. Will you hear our message, Shabbataka, Prince of Cush? On your knees, shouted the Somali spokesman. On your knees before the god. What god? Cried Amos. I don't see a god. I see a man waiting for news. Joyful news, Shabbataka. Your brother has been restored to you. Taharka, king and Pharaoh, has been restored to his people. Taharka? For a moment, the silence hung in the air, like something a man could feel. Then the whispers began, then the voices rising in the air like a wind. Taharka? The people, Talos had said, were not really stupid. And these were the people, the men of Cush, farmers and laborers and herders of cattle chosen by lot, 2 out of every 10. They had wondered, never daring to speak, what had really become of Pharaoh. The kindly boy who had softened the priest's judgment, who, it was said, had once run over to pick up an old lady's comb for her, how had he died? At whose command? Had he died at all? They had been forbidden to say his name, but suddenly that name was on every tongue. Taharka? Taharka? Taharka alive? Shabbataka's eyes had never left his brother's. On that day on the docks at Thebes, he had been taken by surprise, not yet sure of his course. But now, with that forbidden name rising all around him, he knew he had no choice. He knew he had no time. Strike them down! The Somali guards lifted their swords and moved forward. Taharka closed his eyes, then opened them. A king must die bravely. The Somali guards did not seem to be in a hurry, and Amos, always watchful, saw that there were those among the other men who had risen from their knees, who had moved closer to the young Cushite in the shepherd's cloak, whose hands were feeling for their weapons. Shabbataka could see it too. Hesitation. A god could not allow hesitation. He must have obedience, instant obedience, or he was no longer a god. And if he were not a god, strike them down! Taharka looked at him sharply. There was something in that voice from his childhood, something he had never heard in it before. Uncertainty, or was it fear? There was a question in every mind, a question too terrible to be asked, much less answered. Taharka, king and pharaoh, has been restored to his people. Were they, for the first time ever, looking upon the face of the god? Frightened, some of them had hidden their eyes. But the Somali guards had been well trained. They had always been proud of the son of their princess. They had been given a command, but before they could reach the chariot, a man stepped out from among the throng. It's him. He didn't have a powerful voice, but in that silence, it could be clearly heard. It's him. It's Taharka. I know him. I have seen his face. And Taharka had seen his face, heard his voice. Where? When? A long time ago? The river? The green banks of Cush? The black mud and the hot, hot sun? He took his spear and killed the beast that would have killed me. And then he took his sacred cloth and tied up my wound and left the life inside me, just like a doctor. But he's not. He's Taharka. He's the god. The man got down on his knees. He bent his face to the earth. Oh, so that's interesting. That guy who's standing up and saying that it's Taharka was the man that he saved from a crocodile bite at the very beginning of this book. The man got down on his knees. He bent his face to the earth. There was a harsh cry from the blue sky above, a swiftly falling shadow, a hawk for whom Taharka had been named. It flapped down and came to rest on Taharka's wrist. It screamed again and flew suddenly straight at Shabbataka. Shabbataka ducked. The bird passed over his head. A sign! The hawk has spoken! A tall black soldier in the regalia of a commander had come to the fore of the crowd. Remember the other portents? The sun himself has told us that we are led by no true pharaoh. There was a strange sound, a stirring and shuffling, the low hum of voices. Soldiers were falling to their knees, shielding their faces, whispering the unbelievable words. Taharka, Pharaoh, Taharka, king of Cush. Strike them down! It was Shabbataka, almost screaming now. And the voice of Amos, Yahweh be praised, we've won. It was true. A small group of Cushites had fallen upon the Somali bodyguard and driven them back. Shabbataka was surrounded. For the first time, Taharka spoke, crying out over the confusion. Do not touch him. Put up your swords. Bring him to his tent. And that concludes chapter 25 of The God King.